Vendor risk management for small businesses. Why documentation isn't just paperwork. Hey everyone, welcome back to Small Business Risk. Today I want to talk about something that honestly worries me when I'm working with small business owners. Let's talk about vendor risk management. And look, I know that sounds like corporate jargon, but stay with me here because this is the kind of thing that can absolutely sink a business. And most owners don't even realize they're exposed until it's too late. So here's the thing, when you're running a small business, you're wearing like 17 different hats, right? And vendor management often feels like this administrative task that you can just handle on the fly. You know, someone refers you to a good IT company, you shake hands, maybe sign a contract without reading it too carefully, and boom, you're in business. I see this all the time. But, and this is important, every vendor you bring on is actually an extension of your business. They have access to your systems, your data, your customers, sometimes even your financials. And if they screw up, guess whose problem it becomes? Yours. Now, before we dive deeper, if you're finding this useful, do me a favor and hit that like button and drop a comment below. Tell me what your biggest vendor headache has been. I will read every single one of them, and honestly, your experiences help shape what I talk about on this channel. And if you haven't subscribed yet, go ahead and do that too, because we're going to be unpacking a lot more of these practical risk topics. Okay, so let's talk about what really goes wrong. The biggest issue I see with small businesses and vendor risk isn't that they're choosing bad vendors necessarily, it's that they have zero documented process for how they select, onboard, and monitor those vendors. It's all tribal knowledge, all in someone's head, usually the owner's. Let me give you a use case. There's a small e-commerce company, maybe 20 employees, doing about $3 million in revenue. They're using a third-party fulfillment center to handle all their shipping and warehousing. Great, right? Frees them up to focus on marketing and product development. Except they never documented what due diligence they did before signing with that fulfillment center. Did they check references, look at their security certifications, review their insurance coverage, understand their disaster recovery plan? Fast forward 8 months, and the fulfillment center has a ransomware attack. Everything's locked up. Customer orders are sitting in limbo. The e-commerce company has no idea what's happening because there was no communication protocol established. No escalation process. They're just stuck. And here's the kicker. When they finally get access to the fulfillment center's insurance policy, turns out it doesn't cover third-party damages. The e-commerce company is holding the bag for thousands of dollars in missed orders and angry customers. You know what would have prevented that? A documented vendor onboarding process that includes insurance verification, security assessments, and clear communication protocols. That's not rocket science, but it requires discipline. And that's really what we're talking about here, discipline. Documentation isn't exciting. I get it. Nobody starts a business because they're passionate about paperwork. But here's what I've learned over the years. The businesses that survive aren't necessarily the ones with the best ideas or the flashiest marketing. They're the ones with boring, consistent processes that protect them when things go sideways. And things always go sideways eventually. Let me break down what this documentation actually looks like, because I think when people hear process documentation, they picture like this massive binder full of corporate nonsense. It doesn't have to be that way. At minimum, you need 3 things documented for every vendor relationship. First, the selection criteria. What questions are you asking before you even consider working with a vendor? And I mean really documented, not just they seemed nice or my friend recommended them. You need to know, what's their financial stability? Do they have relevant certifications or insurance? What's their track record? Have there been any legal issues or complaints? Here's a use case that illustrates why this matters. Small accounting firm brings on a cloud-based practice management software. Never asks about the vendor's data backup procedures. Never asks where their servers are located. Never asks about their disaster recovery time. 6 months later, the vendor has a catastrophic server failure. All client data gone for 3 days. Turns out their backups were corrupted and they had no redundancy. The accounting firm, they're scrambling, calling clients, trying to recreate work from email threads and paper files. Absolute chaos. If they'd had a documented selection process that required vendors to provide evidence of backup procedures and disaster recovery plans, they probably would have chosen a different vendor. Or at the very least, they would have known to keep their own separate backups. But because it wasn't documented, whoever made the decision just forgot to ask, or didn't know to ask. Second thing you need, the onboarding checklist. Once you've selected a vendor, what happens next? And this is where small businesses really drop the ball. They get the contract signed and think they're done. But you're not done. You're just getting started. Your onboarding checklist should include things like insurance verification, actually getting a copy of their certificate and checking the coverage amounts and expiration dates. Security requirements, if they're accessing your network or handling your data, what are the protocols? Are they using multi-factor authentication, encryption, access controls? Who specifically at the vendor company will have access to your stuff? And what's the process for revoking that access when someone leaves their company? You know what's wild? I've seen businesses give vendors admin-level access to critical systems and never once ask for a list of who has that access. Then someone leaves the vendor's company, keeps their login credentials, and, well, use your imagination. It's not good. Here's another use case. Small medical practice hires a billing company to handle insurance claims. They hand over access to their patient management system, which, by the way, contains protected health information, so we're talking serious regulatory territory here. No documentation of who at the billing company has access. No regular audits of that access. A year later, they find out that the billing company had an employee who was terminated for cause 6 months ago, but that person's system access was never revoked. For 6 months, a disgruntled ex-employee potentially had access to patient records. The medical practice had no idea until they got a random security audit. That's a lawsuit waiting to happen, and it's completely preventable with a documented onboarding process that includes access management protocols. Third thing, the ongoing monitoring process. This is the one that really separates the amateurs from the pros. Most small businesses think vendor management is a set it and forget it thing. You choose the vendor, you sign the contract, and you're done. But that's not how risk works. Risk evolves. Vendors change. Their financial situations change. Their security practices change. Their key personnel leave. You need a documented process for regularly reviewing your vendors. And I don't mean like a 5-year contract renewal. I mean quarterly or at least annual check-ins where you're asking, is their insurance still current? Have there been any security incidents? Are they still financially stable? Is their performance meeting the standards in the contract? Let me give you a real-world scenario. Small manufacturing company uses a single source supplier for a critical component. They've been working together for 3 years. Everything's great, except the small business never documented a process for monitoring the supplier's financial health. Turns out the supplier has been struggling for months, taking on debt, cutting corners. One day, without warning, the supplier files for bankruptcy. The manufacturing company has orders to fill and no way to get the component they need. Their entire production line shuts down. If they'd had a documented monitoring process that included quarterly financial check-ins or credit monitoring, they would have seen the warning signs. They could have started qualifying a backup supplier months earlier. Instead, they're in crisis mode, scrambling to find alternatives and explaining to their customers why orders are delayed. Here's the thing people don't realize. Documentation isn't about covering your ass legally, though that's a nice side benefit. It's about creating institutional knowledge that survives when people leave your company. Because you know what happens in small businesses? People wear multiple hats, and when someone leaves, they take all their knowledge with them. If the person who manages your vendor relationships leaves and nothing is documented, you're starting from zero. You don't know what due diligence was done. You don't know what issues have come up in the past. You don't know what the vendor's responsibilities are versus yours. I've seen this play out so many times. Key employee leaves. New person comes in. They don't know that the IT vendor is supposed to be doing monthly security updates. Updates don't happen. Security vulnerability opens up. Ransomware hits. And when they go back to look at the contract and the communications, it's all scattered across email chains and undocumented phone calls. Nobody knows what was actually agreed to. That's where the discipline comes in. You have to commit to writing things down even when it feels tedious, even when you're busy, even when it's easier to just handle it verbally and move on, because that short-term convenience creates long-term chaos. Now, let me talk about due diligence for a minute, because this is where small businesses really struggle. They think due diligence is just checking a few references and reading the contract. But proper vendor due diligence is actually pretty involved, and it scales with the level of risk the vendor presents. If you're hiring someone to clean your office once a week, your due diligence is probably pretty minimal. Check that they're insured, maybe get a couple references, done. But if you're hiring a vendor who's going to process customer payments or store sensitive data or have access to your proprietary systems, that requires a different level of scrutiny. Here's a use case that shows what I mean. Small software company decides to use a third-party payment processor for their SaaS product. They do the basic stuff, read the contract, check that the company seems legitimate, but they never ask to see the payment processor's PCI DSS compliance certification. They never ask about their data breach history. They never ask what happens to customer payment information if the payment processor goes out of business. 2 years later, there's a data breach at the payment processor. Customer credit card information is compromised. The payment processor shrugs and says, "Sorry, read the liability clause in the contract." The software company is now dealing with angry customers, potential lawsuits, and a PR nightmare, all because their due diligence was superficial. Proper due diligence for a high-risk vendor should include things like requesting evidence of relevant certifications, ISO, SOC 2, PCI DSS, whatever applies to their industry, asking for references from similar businesses, and actually calling them. Reviewing their incident response plan. What happens if things go wrong? Running a background check on the company and its principals if the relationship is significant enough. Understanding their subcontractor relationships. Who are they using, and do those subcontractors meet the same standards? You know what's funny? Small businesses will spend hours researching which laptop to buy for $300, but they'll sign a vendor contract worth thousands of dollars a month after a single sales call. The priorities are backwards. All right, we're getting toward the end here, and I want to make sure you're getting value from this. If you are, help me out. Like this video, share it with another business owner who might need to hear this, and drop a comment. Seriously, what's your vendor horror story? Or if you've got questions about how to actually implement this stuff, ask me. I'll respond. And subscribe if you haven't already. We're building a community here of small business owners who actually want to understand and manage their risks, not just hope for the best. Let me touch on one more thing before we wrap up, and this is about the psychological barrier to documentation. I think a lot of small business owners resist this because it feels like admitting they don't trust their vendors. Like, if you're asking for all this documentation and doing all this verification, doesn't that signal that you don't believe they're competent or honest? And here's what I tell people. Trust is great, but trust without verification is just naivety. Every good vendor should expect you to do due diligence. In fact, if a vendor gets defensive or evasive when you ask basic questions about their security practices or their insurance or their background, that's a red flag. Professional vendors understand that professional buyers do their homework. I had a use case recently where a small business was looking at a new HR software platform. They asked the vendor for a copy of their SOC 2 report. This is a standard security certification for SaaS companies. The vendor said, "Oh, we don't really share that externally." That should have been the end of the conversation right there. Any legitimate SaaS vendor handling employee data should have a SOC 2 and should be willing to share it with prospective customers under NDA. The fact that they weren't willing was a huge warning sign. The business passed on that vendor and found one who was completely transparent about their security practices, happy to provide documentation, even walked them through their incident response procedures. That's what you want. You want vendors who see your due diligence as a sign that you're a serious professional client, not as an inconvenience. So here's where we land. Vendor risk management for small businesses isn't about creating bureaucracy for the sake of bureaucracy. It's about building resilience into your operations. It's about making sure that when something goes wrong, and it will, you're not completely blindsided. You've got documentation that tells you what should have happened. You've got processes that help you respond. You've got a paper trail that protects you legally. And look, I know this sounds like a lot. If you're starting from zero, it can feel overwhelming. But here's the good news. You don't have to build all of this overnight. Start with your highest risk vendors, the ones who have access to your most sensitive data or your most critical systems. Document those relationships first. Build the templates and the checklists. Then, as you bring on new vendors, you use those templates. Over time, it becomes routine. The key is just to start. Pick one vendor relationship this week and document it properly. Write down what due diligence you did or should have done. Create an onboarding checklist. Set a calendar reminder to review that vendor in 6 months. That's it. You're already ahead of 90% of small businesses out there. Because at the end of the day, vendor risk management is really about sustainability. It's about building a business that can survive transitions, that can weather vendor failures, that doesn't collapse because one key relationship goes bad. And that's worth the effort. That's worth the discipline. All right, that's what I've got for you today. Go document a vendor relationship. Seriously, do it this week and let me know how it goes. Send the comments section. Until next time, manage those risks, folks. See you in the next one.